In this chapter, we're going to discuss the issue of designing projects and actions to manage complex problems. When we talk about terrestrial ecosystems, oftentimes we talk about people of very different cultures and backgrounds. That's where the challenge begins. I call this the challenge of designing solutions for complex landscapes. The challenge begins with the fact that oftentimes people who are experts, and this could be international experts or local experts, could be people working in government or in civil society organizations, they have a different cultural upbringing compared to those that are part of these landscapes. And there are language barriers and cultural barriers to begin with. And then we have the challenge associated with the disciplinary training. You have biologists, anthropologists, or foresters, whatever. Each of these professionals have a certain lens, but for most of the time, universities don't teach how to understand beyond the disciplinary thinking of each individual training. So the challenge starts with a cultural difference, and then it goes into disciplinary thinking, and then we have the challenge of engaging people, local people, in designing the logic for intervention and setting up the goals, the long-term goals, which should be seen as the ultimate outcome. To deal with this, we have something called the theory of change, which I like very much, because the theory of change is a framework that allows us to see which are the existing preconditions, and this requires a broad understanding of the complexity of the reality in all aspects of it. And then on the basis of these preconditions that require this cross-disciplinary thinking, we have to engage local communities in designing their vision for the long term. So that should be the direction towards which all actions are taken. And having set this long-term vision on the basis of community participatory planning, then we can start seeing which are the short-term outcomes, which are the medium-term outcomes, and which are the long-term outcomes. And this comprises the basis for action. And in my experience, we have a great success when we're able to engage those communities in the forest landscapes in an active way. But that's not easy. We are going to explore today how we have done this in practice in the Amazon. We divided our complexity thinking here into health, education, entrepreneurship, income generation, infrastructure, environmental conservation, and management and transparency. So these are components of the complexity of communities that live in forest landscapes in the Amazon where we work. So in order to promote sustainable development, we have to have an understanding of all of those components of the reality. And as I said before, this is something that should not be done by professionals of one discipline only. But oftentimes you don't have all the professionals in a particular setting. So what you have to do, you yourself, being you and a specialist of one or the other subject, is to learn a little bit about other areas which are not your area of expertise. But my tip to you is don't shy away from something that you don't know. You don't need to become a medical doctor to understand that improving drinking water, having hygiene, and other simple things are essential component for basic health. And the same goes for education. You have to have school in place, a teacher who is motivated, the educational material, and so on and so forth. So these are the requirements for basic success in education. So if you are a professional with an expertise in a particular area, suppose that you're a forester, it's very important to have an openness and an interest in understanding all these other components. And I have to say from personal experience, it's not difficult not to become a full professional in health or in education or in infrastructure. You have to challenge the other members of your team to do the same, to understand a little bit about forestry if these are health professionals and so on. So that's step number one. Step number two is to learn how to speak to communities. It's not only speaking Spanish or Portuguese or whatever is the language, but learning the ways that people speak, the speed, and gaining confidence and trust. Because if people don't trust you, they are not going to be actively involved in the design of whatever is going to be done. So it's very important to make that bridge between your cultural upbringing and the culture of the society with whom you are working. In our experience, we did something which is a theory of change with two major outcomes. One is improving livelihoods, so this is a social and economic outcome, and the other is environmental conservation, basically reduction of deforestation, reduction of forest fires, and sustainable production of forests and fisheries. But in order to get to those long-term outcomes, it's essential to have a rationale for all the interventions. So if we're thinking really long-term, we have to invest in early childhood development, because if the brains are not well equipped to learn, people are not going to do sustainable management of fisheries or whatever. So that's the long-term vision. If we are able to work with teenagers, that is medium term, because these teenagers who are now 15, 16, 17, they will soon be heads of families, they will be parents, and they will have economic activities which will result in more or less environmental conservation. And if we're thinking short term, we have to work with adults who are already engaged in production and so on. It is important to see which group that you're going to focus on. And of course, the ideal situation is to focus on all age groups, so that you have the work with very young, teenagers and adults. And for each group, there are certain views, certain aspirations, and you have to work with them to come up with what is their aspiration, what is doable. And this, you have to have a rationale for the outcomes that you're looking for, and how each action is going to work with the existing preconditions so that you can improve. So the whole rationale is important to be spelled out very clearly. And that helps the analytical process, which drives and should drive the design of action with the participation of local actors towards producing outcomes in very complex realities. And in doing this planning, you should incorporate also the stakeholders which are relevant. So when you're talking about a community development, it's not only that community that should be engaged. You have neighbors, you have members of the local administration, you have members of other civil society organizations that can be working in the same place. You have political leaders, you have politicians, you have religious leaders. All these stakeholders need to be on board. So having a clear map of all these stakeholders, what are their views, how to come up with win-win solutions, so how to bring everybody on board. So the theory of change is a very useful concept to design a strategy to deal with the complex realities in a participatory fashion. And I'd like to close this with a message that you as a leader or as a participant of a sustainable development process in a forest landscape should give a lot of attention to the design. If you have a good design, that is a very good start. And the design should not be top-down. It should be participatory with the most inclusion and the most participation that you can get.